Unfortunately, I think it's finally time that we make a specific diagnosis, guys. Maximalists of other blockchains appear to be stricken with Cardanophobia, and it seems like, tragically, their ecosystems won't be able to find a cure. Ready? Let's go. Guys, this is a serious affliction. At first, I thought it was just acute haterism, but we're actually dealing with chronic Cardanophobia. We shouldn't be mad at these maximalists of other blockchains. We should offer our support and thoughts for the families of those who are afflicted. Here's what got everybody really excited recently. You'll notice this is a submission on the IOHK Cardano node GitHub. So this is Sebastian of DC Spark 23 days ago, over 3 weeks ago, and he basically points out some things about the current throughput of Cardano, and he goes through a bunch of questions. He says, can we increase transaction size and our block size? Can we increase the mempool size? Should we tackle this at the wallet level? Should we sort the mempool? Should we use various methods? Can L2 fix this? Can we prioritize transactions without doing it in the mempool? A bunch is a fee market avoidable, and basically he's moving towards this has to be solved by a fee market, or at least that's the way I'm reading this section right here. But anyways, he's just basically going through a bunch of throughput questions. Hey, I want to increase the throughput. Here's a bunch of different ways to do it. And it looks like, to me, as I read this, it looks like he's kind of like leaning towards the fee market thing. So, of course, this is over 3 weeks ago. Eventually, Duncan Coots comes into the comments here and he says, hey, there are a few misunderstandings here. And he goes through a series of misunderstandings that he thinks are inherent in the initial post by Sebastian up here. And it's very collegial, very polite, but Duncan basically says, like, hey, the network's doing exactly what it's supposed to. And there are some things we can do to make sure that wallets are interacting with the network exactly what they're supposed to. But basically everything's fine. So I didn't see any additional. There was some additional follow-up. People had some additional questions, and Duncan followed up with some additional comments, but no additional questions from Sebastian that I can see here. It looks like everything's fine, and maybe Sebastian looks at things a little bit differently than people on the inside of IOHK, or maybe Duncan's answers to Sebastian's questions were sufficient. Hard to tell, but it looks like Duncan pretty thoroughly, I mean, he has a bunch of different points here that he goes through. He says one point is a conflation of two unrelated things. On this point, he says this is not really the case at the level of the node. Here, he points out another item he thinks is a misunderstanding, another misunderstanding here. Another item here. I mean, it's pretty thorough. He goes through all of Sebastian's comments very thoroughly. Of course, it looked like Ethereum maximalists picked this up, and you could tell they're experiencing a lot of fear about Cardano. I think they're realizing that the Plutus application backend is about to launch on Cardano, and there's this gigantic universe of dApps that are ready to launch as soon as we have Plutus application backend. And I think they're getting pretty afraid, because a lot of these Ethereum maximalists are probably heavily economically invested in Ethereum, and no increase in functionality by Cardano is good for that ecosystem, really. You could make arguments that flourishing blockchains are good for all blockchains or something like that, but from kind of a game theory perspective, from the perspective of the Ethereum maximalists, the growth and increased functionality of Cardano is not really good for Ethereum. So of course they're jumping all over this, and predictably, it's pretty late. I mean, I saw this blowing up on Twitter just recently, even though this happened 3 weeks ago. And of course, Duncan's response to Sebastian's comments were also over 3 weeks ago, within a day of Sebastian's comments. But they don't bring up any of Duncan's responses to Sebastian. They just bring up Sebastian's responses in a pretty pejorative manner. This is exactly what you do, I think, when you're experiencing extreme Cardanophobia. This is only going to get worse. As soon as we actually have the Plutus application backend and all of those dApps are starting to launch, it's just going to get worse and worse because things are going to be looking worse and worse for Ethereum versus its main competitor, which is us. Meanwhile, Charles and Dynal Patel and John O'Connor and some other people with IOHK were all in Cape Town, South Africa, beginning the Cardano Africa tour. They started out with a fireside chat at the Cape Innovation and Technology Initiative. First up was John O'Connor. The vast majority of you already know him. For those of you who don't, he's the African Operations Director for IOHK. So John let us know there's going to be 6 countries on the Africa tour. This is going to happen over a month. And while Cardano Africa operations currently only have one office in Addis Ababa with 20 people, it all started out, of course, just with one, John O'Connor. Now there's 20 people in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. There are plans for potential offices in Nairobi, Kenya, and also in South Africa. John also, he was kind of giving one of those general overviews of what's going on in Cardano, and he focused on the amount of capital that's been earmarked for innovation in Cardano. And he pointed out some numbers that I think, we all knew they were big, but I think they're probably going to surprise some people because they've grown even bigger than the last time we talked about them. So the C fund is currently at 20 to 25 million. There's going to be a new Africa fund, and it sounds like they might be cutting checks as early as January or February of next year. And the Africa fund, which is intended to create some new African unicorns. Those are companies valued at over $1 billion. The Africa fund currently has $6 million for pre-seed rounds. So brand new companies, just barely companies, or not even companies, right? They're the very beginning of their journey. And there's going to be $6 million allocated to these pre-seed companies. Hopefully one of those will become the next African unicorn. And of course, he also talked about Project Catalyst, which is now at $1.4 billion. That's billion with a B. Project Catalyst has $1.4 billion, almost $1.5 billion for all of the best ideas in the entire Cardano ecosystem. Next up was Dynal Patel, who is the Chief Product Officer of IOHK and coincidentally is actually from South Africa. He talked mainly about Cardano identity solutions and gave a really good overview of how useful identity could be in a country like South Africa. So go ahead and listen to that section of this video if you're interested in that. Next up was Charles, who talked a lot about proving things, identity and voting and academic accomplishment, and why Africa. He talked about how Africa has no allegiance to the old systems because the old systems didn't work out so well for Africa. And he also talked about his smart cow analogy, how once one country finally adopts blockchain technology to prove these kinds of different things, every country will follow because it's going to be so effective. He talked about meeting 3 heads of state on this Africa tour. And he also reminded us of some things that it's easy to forget inside the Cardano ecosystem. He mentioned that there are over 1 million lines of code for Cardano, and you can use it all without paying any royalties. None of it involves any kind of intellectual property protection. Cardano is there. Anybody can use it. The code is there. You can use the code. The blockchain is there. You can use the blockchain. And you don't have to pay any royalties to IOHK, who created this blockchain and created that code. He also talked about something that I think is pretty easy to overlook. He said, as soon as we get digital identity, you can basically get paid for everything you produce instead of the owners of these platforms, people like Mark Zuckerberg or Larry Page, seeing the vast amount of the remuneration for all of the digital things that people create. Instead, once we have digital identity, we can build platforms where the actual creators of all of that all that digital content and work can actually get paid for the things they've created. We also got a 10-minute update from Charles himself, looks like from his hotel room, where he let us know they've been busy in South Africa. He said, I think it was yesterday, they met with the central bank. That's a pretty big deal. They had dinner at Cyril Ramaphosa's place. Also a big deal because that person is the president of South Africa. He also said they met with the innovation division of ShopRite. Again, a big deal because ShopRite is a commercial retailer with 2,892 stores in Africa. That's right, almost 3,000 stores in Africa. He said they're still going to Zanzibar, Burundi, Kenya, Ethiopia, and Egypt. Charles addressed the same transactions per second, TPS, and scalability, FUD, that we talked about at the beginning of this video. He said, hey, Basho is still coming. Right now, we're working on the programmability piece of the Cardano ecosystem. We're going to have the Plutus application backend in November, and we're making a lot of progress on Mithril and Hydra. He said in January, we'll have the EVM and Yella sidechains running as beta. And next year will really be mass commercialization. But you can tell by the way he's talking about it, he's like, hey, look, the network is running just fine. And I think the general consensus seems to be in all the videos I see sort of responding to the same fear, uncertainty, and doubt is that, yeah, there are big spikes in network usage when we have these gigantic NFT drops, but none of this is really anything that we should be concerned about. Like we talked about yesterday, they mentioned it in the IOHK October mid-month development update. And the attitude was kind of like, hey, the network is responding to these spikes in usage exactly like we expect. And there's nothing really to be too worried about. Charles mentioned he thinks there could be a lot of deal flow out of these meetings. They're meeting with 3 heads of state. They're going to 6 countries in Africa. And I think it's going to be an exciting month. I think it's going to be an exciting month where we see the seeds being planted for a lot of deal flow. They've mentioned before that these kinds of nation state deals, they have a long sales cycle. I think I've heard 5 to 7 years to run around. So we might not see the fruition of any of this stuff for some time to come. But I think it's going to be exciting watching sort of the framework get laid for this whole blossoming of Cardano blockchain activity at the nation state level across Africa. I'm excited. I'm going to enjoy the next month, and I will talk to you tomorrow.